You who are joining us on YouTube. We are getting closer and closer to the epicenter of the Pesach season. And I would like to talk a little bit about that and propose to you that we look at some very specific things that are happening with the Passover season as we approach it. I will remind you that it is pursuing us, right? It is trying to overtake us. But if we miss its visitation, then it will pass us by. And then also remind you that last week we talked about the light of Passover. We talked a little bit about Purim. We talked about that if you take the feeding of the 5,000 and make that the pivot point of the Gospels, you get a harmony of the Gospels, and you get a timeline for the information in them as to when something occurred over a Passover to Passover season. Yeshua died at Passover. He initiated his ministry at Passover. And so when we are going through this, a couple things that we want to produce from this. Basically, the first thing is to understand a little bit better what the light of Passover does and how it affects people. And then the second is going to be basically an understanding of what happened in the Garden of Eden. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the Genesis and the image of God. And the reason I want to do that is because in terms of creation and in terms of a process, we know that the sun rising and setting does not create a day. Something else creates a day. And so as a result of that, the truth is that two very important aspects come out of the book of Genesis, and very specifically Genesis chapter 1. The first thing is that in Genesis chapter 1, a very different kind of literary form is present. And that form is basically the type of form that comes out of the book of Proverbs and the book of Psalms. In other words, it's a poem or a song. It has meter and it has some matching elements. For example, day 1 corresponds to a different day, very specifically day 4. Day 2 corresponds with a different day, very specifically day 5, and day 3 corresponds with day 6, and of course day 7 is unique. It has its own thing going on, which anybody who's paid attention to the cycle season, the cycles teaching that began all the way back in November and ended 2 weeks ago, will know that the Shabbat has its own thing going on, right? Okay. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to talk about what it means to have mastery or dominion, okay? Now, in terms of mastery or dominion, what generally you are experiencing in mastery and dominion is an overcoming of a limitation. Case in point, in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 39, which we'll navigate to really quick here. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 39, a very interesting claim is made concerning the children of Israel. And I will remind you that the messages will correspond with the parasha in some way. Remember, I said after the cycle teaching, we're going to get back into the parasha and apply our new knowledge to that, right? The new knowledge we've gained from cycles, what we gained from what light really means, what evil really means, etc., etc., etc. Okay? So then let's go ahead and let's take a look at this. And I'm going to read from, I'm going to read from Deuteronomy 39:1 in the New King James Version. And the reason I like the New King James is because the word evil is still present in that version. Let's take a look at the comparison right here, the Bible comparison. Let's see how many times the word evil is repeated here. So in the CSB, it says, didn't know good and evil, good. Okay, so New King James CSB says it. King James says it, of course. NIV, let's see, your children do not yet know from good and bad. That's interesting. So the New International Version, or the International Bible Society, has decided that the word evil is not what should be translated there, right? Okay. And then what? Let's see, we've got NLT, that they would be, let's see, you were who are innocent children. You're innocent children. Oh, okay, that totally is an interesting way to look at it. And then, of course, Young's Literal goes back to evil. Hebrew Names Versions continues to use the word evil there. NASB 95, which is basically the old NASB, does it as evil, and the revised standard version, or the revised version, the Spanish version, has malo as the word there, and then the revised standard version has it as good or evil. The American Standard Version, which is Catholic version, has it as good or evil. And Darby puts it as good or evil. The founder of dispensationalism, puts it as good or evil. The World English Bible puts it as, good and evil. And the Vulgate puts it as that they were ignorant of distentium. I'm going to say that that is going to be very similar to dysfunction, okay? And then Basic Bible English, your children who have no knowledge of good or evil. Interesting. And then we'll just leave it at that. That's enough of them to say that this being translated here is definitely evil. So here we go. Moreover, your little ones and your children who say will be victims, who today have no knowledge of good and evil, they shall go in there. To them I will give it, and they shall possess it. A couple things. First of all, where does the original promise for the land come from? Was it promised to the children of Israel who came out of Egypt? Answer, no. It was promised to Abraham that his descendants would possess it. What does that mean? That means actually, technically, it could be this generation who possesses it, as long as it's Abraham's descendants. And it will propose to you that he also identified that it would be through Isaac, okay? That he would identify that possession through Isaac, but that it was through the covenant of circumcision, which we won't get into today. But just rest assured that if you want to be a receiver of the promised land, you at least have to be circumcised. And one could argue that it might even tie in today's message, because today's message is about mastery. Okay. Now, here is a very important concept, and that is that having mastery would mean that you have crossed a threshold of adversity that you now have mastery over. Case in point, David comes along as this shepherd boy and is anointed as king by Samuel. However, there is a threshold that David has to cross. And that threshold that he had to cross was that he had to go through a season of being pursued by Saul, to be under the threat of death, to have to participate in things that he would not normally participate in. And interestingly enough, also that he would have to take control of what is nowadays Jerusalem. And so in that sense, I think it's very important to understand that David is an example of a threshold that had to be crossed before he would have mastery. But I will also point out to you that mastery also includes the context of authority. And if it has the context of authority in terms of jurisdiction, in other words, that it was granted by a higher authority, the intensification of all power in the universe, then he is also being commanded to do something in authority. Now, the reason why this is important is because we need to remember that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, it says, we are going to make and we are going to put in authority Adam, right? And Adam then has dominion in verse 27 over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, things crawling on the ground and over the earth, right? Okay. So, mastery. Mastery is the context or concept of no longer being controlled, but to step into a state of control. Now, there's a number of things that you need to understand about mastery. Number one, you need to understand that mastery requires the effort and energy of an external entity. Case in point, if I am engaging in martial arts and I throw a punch and assert energy at another person, their response to that energy and their plan concerning that energy is actually going to affect the fight. Okay? If they block, they deflect the energy, right? If it's more of like an Aikido style of martial arts, then the energy is received and transferred. Okay? The law of conservation of energy is applied in Aikido. But the premise is that in a martial art, the energy of another is used to create new movement or new energy. So rule number one of mastery is that energy has to be coming from an external source, okay? And the premise is that as you engage in the thing that is actually asserting the energy, you need to realize that that is going to require you to have knowledge or understanding. You know, from where I was when I was a child and understanding God and theology until now are not very different. Even when I was a kid, things just didn't feel right. And once I would think about things like what I teach today, they would feel right. Now you say, oh, yeah, you're going off your feelings and yeah, you're not following the leading of the Spirit. Let me be clear. It was the Spirit who was speaking to me. Okay? And it's important for you to understand that my understanding of the Spirit versus your understanding of the Spirit are two different things. But I still make that claim that the same thing that is evident in Scripture in Acts chapter 2, and the same thing that seems to be present, including in David's plea of mercy, saying, take not your Holy Spirit from me, it is very important for you to understand that that is what I'm talking about. That entity, that power, that energy, okay? Now, here's a part that's very important. When you are talking about mastery, you're talking about authority granted by another, and you are talking about energy sent from another, then you need to understand that all mastery is a wielding of that. Okay? It would be like David's situation where he knocks Goliath on his butt, right? And then while Goliath is knocked out, he goes over and he gets Goliath's sword and cuts off Goliath's head. Why is that important? Because he had never touched that sword before. And you want a really heavy one? Check this out. He tried on Saul's armor and was not able to wield it, but he picked up Goliath's sword and he was able to wield it. And so what you need to understand is that authority and that energy are designed to be wielded. Okay? So why is this so important? Because what you're going to find out is that mastery has a limitation. And that limitation is the knowledge of good and evil. And interestingly enough, if you do not have the knowledge of good and evil, then you are the one who can go in and conquer the land. You are the one who can go in and have mastery. In fact, let's look at this word possess real quick. They will go in and possess it. Let's go look what it says here in the Hebrew. if we scroll down to possess it, then we look at this word yarash. Yarash, to seize, to dispossess, to take possession of, to inherit, to occupy, to impoverish, or be an heir. Yarash. Okay? Now, the reason why this is so important is because you need to understand you are not an heir unless you are a son of God. And you are not a son of God unless you are a child of promise. And you are not a child of promise unless that declaration has come. And it's very important for you to understand that that is a mentality, not what somebody said. Somebody said it. Somebody already said it. But what you believe about it is important. However, it is imperative for you to understand. It is not what you do that makes you who you are. Okay? That is so important. Because you do an action does not identify your identity. However, your action is proof of your identity in that what you believe about yourself, you will do. At the core of a wound, I want you to think about a wound for a minute. How does a wound work? Whether we are talking about physical assault, molestation, maybe an act of God, a tornado, a freak car accident, right? A derailing of a train, all are trauma related, right? But what every one of them communicates information about you that you believe. Okay? When your body is thrown around like a rag doll, you don't feel like much of an Elohim, do you? No. So while your car is rolling, you kind of have that humility that you don't have control of the situation. However, that information is false. You do have control of the situation. It's just you don't understand how that works yet. You don't know how to wield that yet to where you could actually, with your mind, your mouth, your will, your intent, stop that car from rolling. In fact, you could even prevent the accident in the first place. You want my proof? Who is this man that even the wind and waves obey him? Do not marvel, for greater things than these will you do. I have yet to control the weather the way I'd like to, especially when I'm in a situation where the weather is affecting my beneficial process, right? Like setting up a campground or dwelling in a campground for that matter. But the point that I'm trying to make is here is in its simplicity. Until you get your head wrapped around wind and waves, I don't expect you to be able to control a rolling car either. But it doesn't mean it's not possible. The problem is that you want it to be plausible first because you don't understand who you are. So let's take, say, a person who has a bad turn of luck and goes in and robs a convenience store, puts a gun to a person's head and says, "Give me all of your money or I'm going to shoot you in the head." Now, the person in the convenience store does not know whether the gun is loaded or not, unless they got a really good eye, does not know whether the person intends to shoot them or not, and does not think that it is worth it to fight them, right? So they give the money, and then now what? They've got 6 months of therapy because they've become a quote-unquote victim. Because the information that was communicated at that moment said that they did not have control, and therefore they should not have control ever, and therefore that becomes a wound, a lie, a false information, creating a false Elohim. We'll get into that a little bit later. Creating a false Elohim that then will what? From now on, not think that they are worth anything. You say, how's that possible? Because I've talked to robbery victims who don't want to have their business anymore, who don't want to walk the streets anymore. You should be walking down the street as a king, broad shoulders, chest pushed out. Why? Because you're a master of the universe. You've been made a little lower than Elohim, according to Psalms 8, and you are Elohim, according to Psalms 82, and according to John chapter 10. And so somewhere in there, we need to realize that any information, whether it be anomalous or whether it be intentional from another human being that tells you that you are not worthy or not special or not a manifestation, oh, that's a bad word, isn't it? An emanation of the intensification of all power in the universe is a lie, but you believe it. You choose to believe it, and that's a wound. And a wound becomes the information by which you make your life's choices and decisions, micro adjustments, and formulates your fears. Now, here's the amazing thing. Going back to Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 39, let's look back at what it says here. In verse 35, actually, let's go there. Surely not one of these men is of this evil generation shall see that good land of which I swore to give your fathers. Oh, goodness. Okay. So let me get this straight. He calls the generation who is not okay, let me rephrase this. He calls the generation who are not masters, who do not have mastery and therefore are not enabled, and that's going to become evident here in a minute, are not enabled. He has them, what? He has them not go in. But the children who they believed would be a prey, where is that? That's in Numbers where it says, our children will be a prey to them. What does that mean? That means that they will want to sacrifice our children to their gods. And they will want to exploit our children. Because that's what the Canaanites did, and that's why they were going to be wiped out from the land. Even if you watch some Christianized version of the Bible stories, every one of them will put in there how the people who were being driven out or the people who were experiencing the plagues were harming children and exploiting women and putting men into chattel slavery. Right? Men were property to be sold and exchanged, right? Without cause. You see, there is absolutely indentured service. It flat out says in Proverbs, the borrower is servant slave to the lender. The lender is a master. So make no mistake, that's where slavery comes into Torah. Ownership without cause is a very different situation. Now, granted, there's a different kind of politics in the Middle East, but the short version of this is it was wicked to own people without cause. And so that was one of the things that was a justification for the eradication of the Canaanites. Why do I bring that up? Because there are people who will have the nerve to say that Joshua was not justified in his conquest of Canaan. And I'm here to say that not only was he made a master of Canaan, but he was given the energy, and I don't mean the physical stamina, but the actual power of the universe to accomplish that task to the extent of bringing down the famous and most powerful walls of Jericho. Now, why is that so important? Because when we get into mastery, we need to think about the fact that that jurisdiction was granted for a purpose. But we also need to realize that that authority that we have been given means that we are enabled, and that enabling is the energy or power. And falling into the flow of it, it's falling into the cycles of that energy and power. But we won't get into that, except that why else would you walk around Jericho 7 times for 7 days and march and yell and blow shofars? Unless you were creating a cycle, unless you were creating Hertzian energy that was somehow going to affect the walls of the city. Now, there is plenty of logical, scientific explanations for the walls of Jericho. But one of the ones that you really need to get your mind wrapped around is the curse of Jericho. Did Joshua have to give Jericho to Yahweh? No, he did not. He chose to so that the people would not begin their journey thinking that they took something, right? They would not begin their journey thinking that they were the ones who accomplished it. Remember, I told you, I don't care if you work a 9 to 5, you actually are not the one producing your income, right? So it is irrelevant what you think about that situation. It is important for you to realize that your provision is going to come regardless of what you do, but don't think that you can stand idle either because you have a purpose. Okay? All right. So, why is this important? Because I want you to notice that what we're experiencing in Deuteronomy here is basically the statement that a master will be able to take the land, but a person who does not have mastery is not enabled. Where's our proof? After Moses says, y'all are not going in. It's done. Pack up your stuff. We're leaving. And the next morning, a whole bunch of people try to take the promised land. And what happens? No dice. Yet 40 years later, Joshua walks in and read the book of Joshua. And you tell me whether he was enabled or not. In fact, to the extent that there's actually a point in time where there's a warrior who Joshua encounters and asks what he is involved with. And of course, he says, I am the commander of the Lord's armies. Right? Now, I want you to understand that that illustration is indicative of some principle of knowledge of good and evil. Knowledge of good and evil is a function of failure, not of mastery. You say, wow, I better find out what the knowledge of good and evil is then, huh? Yeah, because the truth is that any time that you operate within your damage, you are going to do damage. Anytime you operate within your true identity, you are going to change worlds. You are going to affect souls not even born yet. And so there's a compare contrast there. So I guess we should probably find out what the difference between the two is. And let's see if we can see a pattern in that would kind of correspond to something very important that we encounter in this parasha. Okay? All right. So first off, I think let's go ahead and let's shoot over to Genesis chapter 1. Really quick. And so the first thing that we need to do is accept that light is not let's do this. Light is not photon emission in the Bible. Okay? However much you want to see that, even if you see a sunrise mentioned, the light from that sunrise is not rays from the sun. Okay? I even know that there's some sort of thing about a mention of a light casting a shadow, etc. But I want you to grasp the fact that if we really wanted to illustrate light from the pictographic set that the Hebrews used, we would have written it differently. Let me show you. Okay? So first and foremost, the word light itself is going to be the Hebrew letter Aleph, Vav, Resh. Okay? Aleph, Vav, Resh. That's a horrible Aleph. See if I can do just a little bit better there so it doesn't look like an H. Aleph. That's a little better. Yeah, meh, whatever. All right. So that is the word light. In fact, let me go ahead and we will document that here. Okay. Light. And put this in quotations. Okay. It is pronounced or. Put a in your O. Or. Okay. Or is a technically is the concept of ordering structures. Okay. In fact, the first pronunciation of order is or. Okay. But generally speaking, think of it in terms of placing something in a sequence from 1 to 10 or placing things organized into a box. Okay. Now, however much that's true, and this is the ancient pictographic definition. Let me show you. Okay. Before we move any further, I want to show you that the ancient pictographic definition of or is this. Actually, it's probably not going to be the ancient pictographic definition, it's going to be the ancient nomadic definition, which we consequently can get into here. So let me just go ahead and I'm going to navigate to or real quick here, just to save some time. And here, I'll go ahead and share my screen so you guys don't get bored. Aleph, Vav, Resh. So here we go, ancient pictographic Hebrew, bloop. And, oops, nope, that's not the one. Gotta come down here into the lexicon and get it. There we go. All right, and here you go. So you see, it's the word light, right? Okay, going back to the parent root, PR. That's what PR means in the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible, parent root. And you see it's Aleph Resh, right? Oh, looky here. Look at this right here, this pictographic thing, right? Says question mark. Why? Because it's an Aleph and a Resh. We'll get back to that. But it says boxes are used to store items and keep them in order. Light is also necessary for order. Oh, that was about as vague as we could possibly get there. Let's go back to the board. Okay, so now you understand this is the pictographic. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and label this pictographic, right? We're going to say this is pictographic. Okay? Problem, or I'm sorry, not pictographic, nomadic. Nomadic definition. Nomadic. Meaning in their minds, when they would say or, they were saying that a structure was ordered in some fashion, right? Okay, and then what we have is we have a concept or an idea that in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, we have the ox's head. Let's see, let's go ahead and we will draw that. Let's go ahead and draw that in yellow, okay? Like this here. Okay, and then we have the tent peg. And ordering structures is in my way. Let's see if I can fix that. Thank you. Okay. And the last one, of course, is, and of course, this is no relation to anybody that we know. I'm not trying to deface anybody or any of that. Okay. And so here we go. There's our guy. And of course, that is the human head, right? That is the head. Okay. So now the short version of this would be that this is strong. This is secure or establish. And this is head or mind. Now, we've learned this, right? We already know that this is the concept of a strong mind, right? But the problem is that it's translated into English, even by the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society. So even by the quote unquote Hebrews, they translate it as light, and so does our lexicon writer. It says that it's light. But the nomadic definition is order, right? Or the ordering of structures, right? And then we have this concept of a strong mind being completely foreign to this process, right? Okay, the reason why this is important is because the way that I want you to think about this is when we're working with a strong mind, we're not working with photon emission. This is photon emission. Okay? This isn't photon emission, but this is the ordering of structures, right? Or sequencing. This over here, right? But what in the world is going on here? Let me show you how light should have been written, okay? So first of all, let's say that we work with what we have. So what do we know about light? We know light is some sort of wave, right? Okay, so it would probably need to contain water, which is our mem. We know it has something to do with emission from the intensification of heat, which we could probably accept as the kof in some form, right? And then what would we say? We would say it also acts like a particle and therefore has something to do with shooting something straight. Well, we don't really have something to indicate shooting something straight. But what we do have is this idea of security or of joining. We could go with that. However it works out, kof mem should be the word for light. Okay? Or what if we were just to go with the fact that it's just genuinely good, just going to be accepted that it's just the kof? Who knows? But it's not Aleph Resh. Let me make this clear. Aleph Resh is not known. But what have we done? We have seen past that into the actual pictograph. These ancient Hebrews said, and God said, let there be a ox with a human head pictograph, or pronounced strong mind. Okay. Now, the reason why that's important, because now we accept that this evening and morning and this day one have nothing to do with the rising and falling of the sun in our quantification of time. Anything that is quantifiable is involved in either height, width, depth, or time in terms of quantity, in terms of quality, etc., etc. But that's not what this is talking about here. So day one has to do with a strong mind. If we accept that and we work all the way to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, then we accept that a strong mind has to have the qualities of a master who is enabled and the power of a master. Neither of which are the masters, but are wielded by the master. Why did Yeshua say, greater works than these will you do, if he was the only one who A, provided the power, and B, was the only one who could activate the power? No, he is the power. Okay? That's how you need to think about this, is that the Torah is the force or the enforcement, or what we would call in legal terms, the instrument of the will of God. The instrument of the will or the intention of the intensification of all power in the universe. And that instrument became so corrupted in the minds of men that it had to come down to earth as an emanation into flesh, experience the corruption of flesh, and what? What does it say? For what the law could not do, and that it was weak in the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, that the righteous requirements of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to this flesh, but according to the Spirit. In other words, those who have mastery will keep Torah. Ooh, that's nasty. Okay, so now, why do I say that's nasty? Because y'all, see, the people don't like that. People don't like it. They don't like the idea that they got to follow some rules. Okay, now, since we've established that the pictograph light doesn't mean photon emission, we can then accept that the pictograph C does not equate to photon reception. Okay, let me explain. All these little round, squishy, gooey organs in your head are light receivers. And you actually have 3 of them in your head. You have your 2 eyes and you have your pineal gland. Pineal gland has rods and cones just like an eyeball and determines light and darkness in such a way as to produce a hormone to help you sleep. When it experiences darkness, melatonin is released. That is the main physiological function of the pineal gland. Why is that important? Well, when we start to get into the idea that photon emission equates to sight, then we accept that a strong mind does not equate to photon reception, but instead to how a strong mind operates. Okay? And of course, you guys remember that that had to do with whether the Aleph is on the one side or the other side of the Resh and what precedence it was given. Okay. So now, the reason why this is important is because now we could accept that if you have wounds, entitlements, or limiting beliefs, you cannot have mastery. Well, then all of a sudden now we have a problem, don't we? Because that's all of humanity. All of humanity is wounded. And it says specifically that they are wounded from childhood. Because why? We're taking that word evil and making it to be understood as a wound. Why? Well, interestingly enough, if you were to take a strong mind and convince it that it did not have the identity that it thought it did, you would persuade or twist the truth about that strong mind. Let me see if I can illustrate this in a practical way. You take a baseball, and I want you to think about baseball for a minute. Lovely sport where everybody sits around for about 3 hours watching somebody hit a piece of cork with a piece of wood, and everybody goes nuts over where it falls. Okay? The purpose behind the piece of cork wrapped in leather is to have it fall somewhere. And the reason we want it to fall somewhere is because if it falls somewhere and it's in your favor, then it feels great to have it be in your favor. If it falls somewhere and it is in the other team's favor, then of course you don't feel so good, and thus we get the idea of competition here. But the premise is that that ball has a purpose. Now you're going to come along, okay, and you are going to tell that ball that it is no longer a ball. Now the ball itself believes that. and goes about its life now as a taxi cab. Okay, so it pulls up to the curb and it says, "Hey, would you like a ride?" And the person looks at the ball and says, "How am I supposed to get in that?" Right? And so he goes along the curb, still thinking that he's a taxi cab because somebody told him he was a taxi cab. Is the ball a taxi cab? No. Does it believe that it's a taxi cab? Yep. Is it acting like a taxi cab? Yep. Okay. So you see the absurdness here, right? The absurdness is that that ball is so wounded, it's been persuaded to believe that it's a taxi cab. Could it ever give somebody a ride? Nope. Does it think it can? Yep. Why? Because somebody lied to it. And perhaps maybe the reason for that is because somebody was being contrary to that ball or abusive to that ball and told that ball that that's exactly what they were. And so the ball believed it. Why? Because at the core of definition of identity is trust. You cannot come up with your own identity, but you can believe what others say about your identity and be it. And that's why it's very important who you listen to. And the who would be your creator or your intensifier, right? We know that word doesn't mean create. That word means intensify. And so we could accept that really what it is that you are an emanation of the intensification of all power in the universe, dumbing down through transformations that occurs in such a way to eventually bring you to who you are now. And one could argue that the most important element of who you are is not defined by what other people think of you. Not one person's opinion about you is factual compared to the opinion of the identity of the intensification of all power in the universe. Quite frankly, it's a baseball. It's the intensification of all power in the universe. You can't convince the intensification of all power in the universe, however dialed back he is, that he is a taxi cab. But you could convince something that was an emanation of the intensification of all power in the universe that it was a taxi cab. So why is this important? Because a false identity creates a false Elohim. In other words, the image that Yahweh is concerned about in Exodus chapter 20, when he says, "You shall have no other gods before me," he means gods that are defined by something other than his determination of a God. Why do I say that? And of course, I'm using the G word here, right? Really should be using Elohim, but you haven't quite grasped yet Elohim. And the reason I know is because I still hear people in this congregation or even on the YouTube comments saying the word God. Okay? Okay. Now, what is important about this? It says the children who you said would be a prey. So here's the interesting thing. This is wow, right? The parent says, "My child will be a victim of violence. Therefore, I am not going to go into the promised land." The intensification of all power in the universe, emanating through Moses, says, "You said you will not go into the promised land because you didn't want your children to be hurt. They're the ones that are going to take it. And the reason they are is because they don't know good or evil." Boom, right? Why? How is this possible that they not know good and evil? I thought every human being knew good and evil. Well, let's propose that we probably need to look at the word knowledge first, right? I would say that would probably be a good place to start. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and let's go back to our Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 39 verse, right? And then what we will do is we'll take a look at this. I did numbers. Deuteronomy, that would be better. 1, verse 39. I was like, what is all this stuff about bringing food and stuff? Okay, here we go. Your little ones and your children who you say will be victims, who today have no knowledge of good and evil, they shall go in there, to them I will give it, and they shall possess it. But as for you, turn and take your journey into the wilderness by way of the Red Sea. Bottom line, you're not going in, but your kids will. All right, here we go. Now we're going to go into the interlinear and take a look at this word knowledge, which consequently is yada, right? Yada. And it means to know and learn, right? We're not going to get into all the different stuff here. All I want to do is go to first usage. All right. And we will go to the first usage is going to be in Genesis chapter 3, verse 5. And of course, this is where the serpent is speaking, right? For God knows in the day that you eat thereof, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Okay, before we get too far into this, I have a question. And that question is the serpent lying here? Well, let's find out. Let's go down to verse, I believe it is 22. Then Yahweh Elohim said, behold, the man has become like one of us to know good and evil. So going back to chapter 3, verse 5, we can say that there's no lie being communicated here, right? Because it says, for God knows that in the day that you eat of it, your eyes will be open. Let's see if that's true, if the eyes were opened. Oh, look at 7. Then the eyes of both of them were opened. Okay, let's just stop for a second here. So no lie, absolute truth that that's what was going to happen if they did this. Now, in the peculiarity of the concept of knowledge, let's talk about this for a minute, because I've mentioned before there's 3 kinds of knowledges, right? There's spiritual knowledge, written knowledge, and experiential knowledge. Spiritual knowledge is intuition, right? And written knowledge is the Bible, the 66 book compendium determined, 400 to 600 years after Yeshua to be the appropriate words to be read by a believer in Yeshua. We will accept that is written knowledge. Okay. Then we have the spiritual knowledge, which is, of course, the intuition. And then we have experiential knowledge is actually what you have gone through and learned from. Now, I would tell you, because of how we're wired, experiential knowledge will override the Bible. That thing, those 66 books, that written knowledge and experiential knowledge will unfortunately override intuition. Now, it's important for you to know that the most authoritative of the 3 would probably be intuition, but you cannot deny the things you've experienced in the perception of how you looked at those things and believed that that's what was happening. Okay. The reason why that's important is because if the eyes of both of them were opened, and they now had a knowledge of good and evil, then we should probably find out what knowledge of good and evil is. So let's start at the beginning and find out what the word knowledge means, okay? So fortunately, we can just go straight from this verse right here. Back to our word yada, and we can grab the Strong's Concordance number here. And of course, this is a child root. I don't need to remind you why it's a child root. You can Go back and watch other videos and learn what a child root is. But what we're going to do here is we're going to put in this Strong's Concordance number. Of course, in the lexicon, we don't have numbers, right, corresponding. And so we're just going to go look up the number this way. We don't have the Strong's Concordance numbers H and G, right? And then let's see, 45. And then we will go over to our parent root, which consequently is Dalet Ayin. Okay? And I want you to see that the concrete is I. Okay? I. And the action is to see or know, and the abstract is knowledge or the word why. Okay? In fact, medua in the Hebrew, medua is a combination of mem, dalet, vav, and ayin, and it means why. Medua, what's the cause or what's the purpose? All right, pictograph. The pictograph, dalet, is a picture of a door. The ayin, picture of the eye. Through the eyes, one experiences his world and learns from it. Combine these mean the door of the eye. The eye is the window into the man's very being. Experience is gained through visual observation. Knowledge is achieved through these experiences. Okay? Oh, look at this. Here is this is the nomadic definition. An intimacy with a person, idea, or concept. There's a function in, I believe it's Sanskrit. It might not be Sanskrit. It might be, I don't know. I don't remember which language it actually could be defined as, but it is a concept in the East of saying this soul of me sees into your eyes and sees the soul of you. And what does that mean? I think it's pronounced namaste. But what does that mean? That means I see that you are actually an emanation of the divine. Okay, so let's start at the beginning here, and let's look at this one really quick. To possess an intimate knowledge of is to have an opinion, right? Comprehension as an intimacy with a person or an idea or concept. Let's check this real quick. So somehow the I, which has to do with the strong mind when we're looking at the Resh Aleph or Ra'ah, which is or Re'ah, which is basically to see. The eye, that organ that has the rods and cones to intercept photon emission, seems to also be connected in with to be able to see the soul. And intriguingly enough, the first instance of an interaction between two humans and the word yada is Eve's conception of Cain. Okay? And we know that there are other mentions that have to do with the carnal or the physiological copulation of a male and a female, or the Torah prohibited copulation between the male and a male. Now, the reason why this is important is because we know in Sodom they say that they want to know the men who are in the house of Lot. Well, there's some importance here because when we get into the focus of the word knowledge, we can now understand that on the physiological level, it equates to and has nothing to do with thought, has nothing to do with the process of information in such a way as to call it knowledge, but instead has to do with copulation. Which means The only way to really understand knowledge is to dismiss the physiological reality. What am I trying to say? I am trying to say that it is an abstract thing to think of the word yada as being information to be processed. In other words, it is an idiom. It is literally the idiom of copulation. Okay? So if the idiom of copulation has something to do with having a close-in knit relationship with that information, that's where we call it knowledge. So what we need to ask first is there a precedence for copulation in the instructions concerning the tree of knowledge and good and evil? What I mean by that is there any precedence for sexual perversion or something else? Because I can tell you, if there's any precedence for copulation, then we have to accept that it's perversion or it wouldn't have been prohibited. Because at the core of sexual copulation is divinity. My proof is in the fact that that's the only time when we are able to do something greater than any other thing that we accomplish, and that is to create another life. That is the only time when that occurs. Okay? All right. So, in terms of that, the next and most important thing that we need to look at is, what would that have to do with good and what would that have to do with evil? Okay, so the first thing that we probably need to do is go back and look at the word good really quick. Okay, so let me go ahead and we will switch over to the board. And let's see here. So we have the word good being the tet, right? The vav and the bait. Okay, that's actually not correct. How did that? There we go. All right. And in the ancient, okay, so we're going to just put the pronunciations up here real quick. To be what? They're going to be, oops, right here. This is tov. You ever hear somebody say mazel tov, right? When somebody has a baby, when somebody gets married, when somebody has good success in business, they say mazel tov. The truth is mazel tov is actually good zodiac, but we won't get into that. All right, so this is good, right? Good. All right, and then we have the ancient pictographic expression of a basket or a container or something that, it's interesting, there's actually a concept here that this is something that actually repeats itself, right? And intercepts its tail, but we won't get into that today. All right, here we go. So then we have the ancient Hebrew bait, which is a tent. So in the ancient pictographic literal definitions, we go with what? Container. Secures or establishes. Tent. So what does good mean in the ancient pictographic Hebrew? The ancient pictographic Hebrew basically says that a container establishes the tent would be a full container And so this goes back to the agricultural process. This goes back to the ancient Hebrew mindset that a full belly equates to what? Life. And a not so full belly equates to death. And so the way that I want you to think about this is that there is a premise of a container of grain sitting in the tent, establishing the tent as what? Being provided for. And so that's how you want to think about the concept of good, is that there was a harvest abundant. It was a tent that was dwelling in abundance. Okay? Okay. Well, that's interesting, because now all of a sudden what we do is we say that means that we are talking about the opinion of a Hebrew man or woman as to whether or not they feel like they are okay in terms of their hungers. What do I mean by that? I mean that the idea of Tov is based upon the idea of the provision of the tent, okay? We can go back into the ancient Hebrew here and take a look at that real quick in terms of that. So let's see, we're going to go, I'm just going to go type Tov into this. And of course, I'll share this with you guys because you'll get bored. Okay. Going to the keyboard, we'll say tet, vav, bet, tov. And if we go back to the parent root, it says that it's fresh, moist, or good. Notice the abstract is good, which means it's an idiom. So let's look at the pictograph. The pictograph tet is a picture of a basket used to contain or surround something. Beit is a picture of a tent or house. Combined, they mean surround the house. The house is surrounded by grace, beauty, love, health, prosperity, something that is functional, something that is functions properly. So I'm going to tell you that the reason why this is coming up as function is because it is within its proper cycle, okay? It's in its proper cycle. Because for something to be functional, it has to move, and of course, the word good or the word tov moves in the cycle of abundance. And the cycle of abundance is the cycle of Israel, with the Israelites being obedient to what? To the tithe, or being obedient to the contribution to the poor, which prevents them from becoming fat. You want to overcome the golden calf season, equally distribute your wealth. Okay. So now, and this is important, when we're dealing with the word good, we need to understand that it is a concept or a belief of comfort and contentment. Okay? Comfort and contentment. But you all also know that when you think of something, if I say that's a good person, do I say they're a good person because they have abundance? No. Do I say they're a good person because they have perfection? No. Something causes us to experience a positive regard for something, and that results in us opining the concept of good and assigning that attribute to whatever it is. We are experiencing some form of good, then we label it good. Now, the intrigue is that the opposite of that in our minds is evil. Now, there are three definitions that we need to work with here when it comes to evil. If we're working with evil in the sense of that it is discomfort, adverse conditions, or discontent, then we can accept that if we were to call something evil, that basically it just means that it's not comfortable, or that it doesn't cause you to feel content, and it doesn't necessarily that it is adverse to you. It's somehow being an adversary to your process, right? A hindrance, if you will. And so we call that evil, call that bad, good and bad. And there's only one translation who actually gets it right in that sense, and that's the NIV. But then we have another definition of evil, which is a proper definition of evil when it comes to Christianity, and that is malevolence. Let's define malevolence. Malevolence is when you choose to do dark things to accomplish good. There's that word, good. So malevolence means that you do things to cause yourself to feel comfortable. You do things that cause yourself to feel content, and you do things to cause yourself to feel unhindered that violate someone else's rights, right? And let's say rights in terms of protections, right? Because we're dealing with Hebrew here, not American. And then some that you would somehow accomplish that through false information. Okay, so there's two elements to malevolence. One is that you're trying to accomplish contentment, comfort, and unhindered process through the use of darkness, which we'll accept as manipulation, coercion, or force, right? And most of the time it is on your behalf. Now, there are some exceptions to that. Sometimes it can be on behalf of someone else, and you are still accomplishing those things in a malevolent way. And then finally, there is the evil that is, of course, looking back to or recapping a very, very important point, that evil, drawn in Hebrew as a resh and achin, and we know that achin is basically has two definitions to it, but in this case it is not the definition of sight, but instead the definition of twisting. And so, of course, if I was going to come and illustrate this, I would say it is the not the ox's head. It is our guy here who looks like somebody, but it's not who you think it is, right? And then we have the twisted rope. Okay, and so what we have head or mind twisted. Right? Head or mind twisted. Okay, so if we have head or mind twisted, then we can identify that there is a context here of that there's something that occurs to create the twisting. So we could even do a compare contrast here, couldn't we? We could say head in the same spot that it is for this part, right? Strong. So there's the reciprocal, right? So the opposite of evil in ancient pictographic Hebrew, which would be what's in your Bible, and in other words, if you're reading the Bible and you think that evil has anything to do, this is important. If you're reading the Bible and you think anything evil has anything to do with malevolence, you got another thing coming. Evil in the Bible because of the pictographs. Look, I could go back and I could draw you the word evil in the right pictographs. In other words, I could demonstrate for you and disseminate off of the available pictographs true evil, true malevolence. But that's not what we're working with here, is it? Right? Okay, now, I've often told you, you cannot be defeated. You can only be persuaded. But there's something very, very, very important about what's happened here. And that is, we don't have an ayin like this and the resh like this, do we? And what do we know about the place of honor or the right hand side? We know that the right hand side gets the precedent and augments the thing to the left. So in this case, this mind is augmenting the strain. And in this case, the mind is twisting. Why is that important? Why is that important? Because you're the one who is persuaded and believes the lie. You're the one who creates the definition from the wound. Don't get me wrong. It is absolutely insanely difficult to feel okay when trauma occurs. All I'm saying is that you allowed that trauma to define who you are instead of allowing the ultimate authority to define who you are through the proof of your existence. I want you to understand what Paul is saying in Romans chapter 1, verse 18, 19, and 20. He's saying that everything that you need to understand about who you are, who Yahweh is, and what the connection between them is in nature, is in what has been made. Not what man has made, but what has been made, okay? And we really need to kind of get into the idea of what has been intensified, but we're not there yet. Okay, now, why is this so important? Well, first of all, you need to understand that the twisting of the mind in the first place, you do, okay? You're the one who tweaks the reality, not the trauma that's happening to you. The trauma that is happening to you is feedback on the system. But the system's adaptation to that feedback is not based upon proper thinking. Because you need to always default to he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. I will have you know, I am the righteousness of God. Now, I spend my days trying to believe that. Why? Because I have lots of information that says I'm not. But that information is trauma. That information is feedback that has told me that through one interaction with a human or another. Okay? Now, what's really important is that you need to decide whether or not you like that lie. And that's the key here. If you don't like who you are, it is probably the result of a wound. Now, what's interesting about wounds is that it will cause us to develop basic instinctual fears. What do I mean by that? That you will have a fear of some sort of interaction with humans as a result of your wound. Okay? Wounds are always past information that work upon the present as a frame of reference that cause you to make micro adjustments in your lifestyle. Now, what's important about that is when we start to interact with other humans. For example, a person might have had a trauma that caused them to not want to be poked in the ribs, let's say, okay? And that person will now have somebody who loves poking people in the ribs. Everything about that person screams benevolence, right? But in the moment when they poke that person in the ribs, how does that other person feel about that person? So person A is the wounded person. Person A has a preference of not being poked in the ribs because of the memory mnemonic, right? The neuropeptidic information processing storage says poking in the ribs equates to this discomfort, which is some sort of trauma, which we won't label because we don't need to. Person B is completely benevolent, completely pours themselves out, is a blessing to everybody around them, has mastered kindness, but likes to poke people in the ribs. So they come along, they poke the person in the ribs, and of course the person reacts and says, don't poke me in the ribs. They've just made a micro adjustment on that person's life. If that person wants to interact with that person, they cannot do what it is that's part of their jovial existence. So person A is actually what? Operating within their wound, right? Which is really just a twisted rope. Now, the reason why this becomes important is because we need to realize that the information being communicated by the intensification of all power in the universe has never told them that they are not worthy of something or that they need to think a certain way or act a certain way. The other information has. Poking in the ribs could be quite fun, but that's not allowed because it's connected with this pain and this discomfort because of an identity that they believe. Now, let's say that a person gets in a car accident, and now every time that they come to an intersection, which you've heard this before, they come to an intersection, they start to get nervous because it's that intersection, right? And so that causes them to what? That causes them to want to put on the brakes, right? Reduce the gas, put on the brakes, and proceed with caution, which consequently affects a lot of other people. Now, here's the crazy part about it, how deep this can go. Now this person has basically started to make life adjustments to their wounds, and those life adjustments are now affecting everyone around them because why? They're going 30 and 45 because they're scared. But the truth is they don't know why they're scared. They just know they slow down at that intersection. In fact, what's crazy is that the light might be green and they should just be proceeding through at the speed that they were going. Now the person behind them sees that person slowing down and they're already late. You have no idea what level of goo that just created, right? Okay. Now, the reason why this is relevant and important is because what you need to know is the difference between a master and a slave. Let's talk about chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is basically slavery that is ownership or property of a human being without merit. What do I mean by that? I mean that there is no debt, right? And I want you to understand this still happens to this day. It's just you don't have to do what you would have to do back then. So a person will come along and they'll borrow from somebody, right? Now they get into a position where they cannot pay that borrowing, right? They can't pay that quote unquote debt. In ancient Hebrew times, you went to work. you immediately went and worked that person's property. Now, it's important for you to know that now in modern times, your debt is a certificate that says that you owe this much money. A certificate that is what's called an accounts receivable. An accounts receivable then can be what? Sold to another company, and therefore now it's their accounts receivable, which means what? They have the potential to have the money instead of that person. That's basically the selling of notes, if you will, or that's the acquisition of notes, buying somebody's debt. The only difference is that nowadays you do not have to work for the person, you just have to provide the legal tender to satisfy the debt. And so that's indentured service even today. And you are property even today because your debt is sold to somebody else. So make no mistake, the slavery of the Bible still exists. It's just you don't have to work for the person. You still have to work, but you don't have to work for the person. Okay? That's the only difference is that they don't actually have you on their property working for them. They don't have you down at Stanley, Morgan Stanley pushing leaves, right? They have you working your butt off, transferring money into an interest-bearing account that may or may not ever be satisfied. But make no mistake, your incurrence of that debt, your accrual of that debt is resultant in you being owned. And that ownership can be transferred to another person. So a slave could be sold, right? Now, where we get into unmerited slavery is when somebody takes control of another human being as a result of kidnapping, which consequently in Torah is punishable by death. And so what you need to know is that chattel slavery is not legal in Torah. But the reason I bring this up is because the mentality behind chattel slavery is that that person controls you. That person has you. That person has defined you. Don't get me wrong, okay? The chattel slavery that was practiced in America, in the United States, had such a strong ability of ownership, it was almost impossible for a slave to escape. They were very good at containing their slaves. But part of the mentality that made a slave do what they were supposed to do had to do with the belief that they were a slave. Now, the reason I want to get into this is because I want you to understand the context of slavery in the sense of mastery. In other words, you are going to be controlled by another, or you are going to control. I didn't say control another, I just said control. What do I mean by this? I mean that you will wield, or you yourself will be moved or wielded. Okay? Now, in shadow work, we try to identify the faults of who we are, right? Our defects of character. We call it shadow work because it casts a shadow upon the light. Our idiosyncrasies, our wounds, our entitlements, and our limiting beliefs. And idiosyncrasies are preferences based upon wounds or preferences based upon routine or that type of thing. Okay, the person likes to get up in the morning and drink their tea and then go outside on the porch and stretch. And someone the night before left trash out on the porch. Now they can't go outside on the porch and stretch. Their idiosyncrasy is interrupted, and now they are in a state of incongruity. Okay, now the part that is important is the idea that a strong mind will be able to discern benevolence even when there is perceived malevolence. A strong mind will be able to wield the authority and energy of the intensification of all power in the universe. So, why is this important? Well, because first and foremost, you need to understand that the sacredness of the sacredness of the tabernacle, the Holy of Holies, was based upon the profaneness of the Israelites. Let me explain. In the construction of the camp of the Israelites, you had cut off from the people, which was a boundary that was outside of the camp. It was beyond even where the innards of sacrifices were burned. And that place outside the camp was considered to be no man's land because of marauders' exposure from the desert and obviously a lack of provision. The next level was outside the camp. Who were what? People who had made themselves unclean or had become unclean and now had to be away from the rest of the community because they were potentially contagious or they were somehow going to create a bad energy. Okay, we'll get into that in a moment. Next, we have Israelites, those who actually are inside the camp in covenant with Yahweh. Okay? Don't get me wrong, people outside the camp are still in covenant. The ones outside the camp are not in covenant. Okay? Then the next level is what? We have then the Levites, who what? Who were authorized to enter the outer court. And that's it. So they were people who were allowed within the outer court. Okay? And then the next level from that was the priesthood. And the priesthood was allowed to enter the Holy of Holies, or the holy place. And then at the highest rank of all the people of Israel was the high priest, and he was the only one allowed to approach the Holy of Holies. Why? Because everything that pertained to the energy and to the authority of Yahweh began at the high priest and worked its way down to the one outside the camp. Now, the one outside the camp was not in covenant. They were considered the nations or Gentiles. So somebody in covenant could be outside the camp or inside the camp, but could not do what the Levites could do, which was go in the outer court. Somebody in covenant who was inside the camp but was not and was a Levite, but was also a Kohen or a priest, could go into the holy place. And then finally, only the high priest, which was a very specific bloodline, the firstborn son of the priest before him, was to go into the Holy of Holies. So we see a distinction here, and we accept that there is a sacredness and a preservation that needs to occur depending on how common you become. So my question to you is this common or uncommon? Is this common or uncommon? The truth is that the master, right, or the strong mind, which consequently is the reciprocal of this one here, because this is where you choose to be it, right? This is seeing. Okay, I'll switch over to this one. This is seeing. The other one, which is the lead ox and the head, oh yeah, that's not anybody you know either. Okay, and that then obviously is light, right? That is light. So the relevance here, the importance is to ask the question, does mastery equate to the common people? Does mastery equate to the people who are in covenant, who are to be instructed, or the people who are in covenant who give instruction? Who's the master? Who has the mastery? Who has the dominion? Now, the reason why this is so important is because the way that I want you to think about this is not in terms of because I'm a rabbi, I'm superior to you, because you could probably have better mastery to me in a number of areas. But more what I want you to think about is the mindset of the twisted rope. The twisting is a persuasion, which means that information was communicated to the system and the system made an adaptation. Right? Information was communicated to the system. Doesn't matter whether it was true or not, the system made an adaptation. So earlier I mentioned something about the light of Passover. And I want you to look at this. And I want you to think about things. Let's see, let's do this. Let's create this thing here. Okay, think of this as the light of Passover. What do we know about it? We know it's unconditional. We know that the power behind it is actually associated with the Messiah. The Messiah is who gives the light of Passover. And that was the result of a resurrection. Okay? And so what we know is that the reciprocal of resurrection is death. And we know at the core of this thing is death, right? We know that a week beforehand, there was a resurrection. And we know a week afterwards, well, let me take this back. A process of 3 days and 3 nights afterwards is a resurrection, not a week. And I'm just gonna throw 2 cents in there just real quick. If you are a Good Friday Easter celebrator, I want you to count your 3 days and 3 nights. Let's start. So what we have Friday. Let's say we give you all of Friday, okay? So we'll just say that the Friday day counts as 1 day. So 3 days, 3 nights, so that's 1 day gone. So then we have Friday night, okay? And then we have another day, which we could go ahead and say that was all day Saturday. And then we have Saturday night, and according to the Easter Sunday tradition, Yeshua rose at sunrise on the 3rd day, which will count as that 3rd day, and then Sunday, wait a minute. I think you get my point. You cannot get 3 days, 3 nights out of Good Friday and Easter. Fix your brain. All right, so resurrection, light operating as a mechanism of deliverance, right? Deliverance, what else? A mechanism of abundance and a mechanism of status change, let's say, okay? what's the result? The result is an operation of abundance, right? And then we have an operation of uh, um, of deliverance. Both of those are a mechanism that is activated through action and intent. So we have these people, right? We have these human beings who have been persuaded. Why do we know that? Because Jacob, Israel, and his descendants were given the dew of heaven. And if you knew what that meant, you would understand why I get so aggravated with them, even though I'm probably not any better. But my understanding and knowledge of it drives me crazy. They should have never, ever, ever been subjected by the Egyptians. They should have never been affected in that way. Now, there is a context here that it was a long, long time. And by the time you got to the generations who were delivered, their parents had taught them how to be and think like slaves, how to survive, how to get through it, right? So then, now, what is required for deliverance? What is the Yeshua principle? What does it say? You will change your identity. Remember, possession versus oppression. Remember, possession versus deliverance. What's known? The Israelites believed that they could not defeat or somehow were allowing themselves to be controlled by the Philistines, by Midian, by whatever other group came along and decided to run their lives in the book of Judges. And then we have another issue. And that other issue is that not only do you have to have an identity change, but then you end up delivering yourself. You say, that's not what the pulpit teaches. That's not what my Bible says. Actually, it does. It absolutely does. It says that you will be delivered by your own hand because your identity has changed from that which is merited and believed to be somehow earned or somehow lost to that which has been titled. Remember, the light of Passover is the result of the resurrection of Yeshua, but the death of Yeshua has retroactively affected everything all the way back to the foundations of the earth, the lamb slain from the foundations of the world. Now, why is that important? Because then we get into the idea of he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us that we might become the righteousness of God, a definition and title that does not have your dirty paws on it. Oh, but it gets better, doesn't it? Because that means that you are in a state of mastery. So the light of Passover is actually an energy that is not your own, that comes from an external source. Whoa! So, Rabbi, are you saying then that it can be wielded? Yes, I am. Right? How was it wielded? Knock, knock, knock. Hi. Was wondering if I could have your gold. Oh, sure. Here you go. Right? And then what's the other part? Walking out of it. So if we accept that the light of Passover is going out all over the place retroactively, right? So this is going to be what? Our negative timeline. So this is going to be our timeline backwards, which we'll call past, which is a really bad way to think about it. And then the other one is going to go forward, which we also call future, which is another really bad way to think about it, right? But we'll just go ahead and go with that. So it retroactively goes out this direction, goes out this direction, right? Okay, so now what we can say is that somehow these saints back here were affected by this, right? These saints back here are affected by this at these intersection points. And what we need to identify then is that as this stuff is going out, it is available. So let's think about this. Let's talk about this. David very, very skillfully orchestrates some stuff in such a way that it doesn't violate Torah and he could never get convicted. Right? Okay. So then because of that, the prophet comes along and says, guy, you think you got away with something here, but the truth is that Torah was never written. Torah was never written. Torah is a retroactive process and a future process as a result of something that happened, right? But in the original process of Torah, Torah was the will of God, which was written on our hearts, right? And now the function of Torah says that however we have these loopholes, you're not supposed to be sleeping with this lady, and you're definitely not supposed to be killing this dude. And so what does David do? He says, yeah, you're right. I got this. And he writes Psalm 51. And Psalm 51 is a reversal of all this darkness. He says, against you only have I sinned. Woo, boy, if you knew the Kabbalistic mysticism behind that statement, it would blow your mind. The next thing is, he says, what? Restore to me the joy of my salvation. We get into soteriology, that part really, really tweaks your brain because we can accept that the only way in which David was saved was as a result of Yeshua, right? Okay, so then restore unto me the joy of my salvation, but then watch this. Take not the Holy Spirit from me. So there was possible that there would be some sort of removal of what? The energy of his authority. The energy or the enabling of his authority. Don't take away the enabling of my authority. I know you'll leave me king because that's just what you do. But don't do like what you did to Saul. Don't take away the power of my authority. Don't take away that. Don't take away my ability to supernaturally interfere with natural order processes. Right? Like what happened with Saul. Saul had the Holy Spirit left Saul, and Saul not only had an evil spirit, but he also had no enabling of his kingdom anymore. And the Philistines had a heyday until David came along, after he was anointed. Okay, so now what do we have? We have the concept then that the joy of salvation is locked into the resurrection, et cetera, et cetera. But what was David talking about? What was he activating within that principle? He was activating the Yeshua principle, yes, of course, to deliver himself from the oppression that had occurred. Now, the reason why that's important is because the only way David could have salvation is through Yeshua, which would have been a retroactive effect, which means the light of Passover goes out after Yeshua dies, but it affects the saints in the past, right? Noah, who is innocent in all of his generations, or pure in all of his generations, through what? Through he made him who knew no sin become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. Abimelech, declaring to the intensification of all power in the universe, who had come down and said, you're a dead man, will you slay an innocent nation, a righteous nation? Would you slay a righteous nation? He's telling God that his nation is righteous, meaning what? We're not going to dwell on merit here. I know that they've done wrong. I know that they're not good people. So we're just going to throw ourselves on the mercy of the throne, and you do what you want. But I did not take that woman because of any guile, right? That's basically what he's saying there. Where else do we see it? Where do we see people defining themselves correctly? There's plenty. There's plenty. Where do we see people not defining themselves correctly? Adam, when he sows the fig trees on himself. He decided his identity at that moment. And I'm going to tell you right now, that identity was not the truth. Right? Okay. Getting back to the knowledge of good and evil. So now, and this is important, and I'm sorry this one's long, but I think it's important. Now what you need to understand is when you are not in the merit of Yeshua, in the sense of he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, and we might become the righteousness of God, you are a slave. And you will operate in what? In merit, in the things that you will say, I am good in your definition of good, and I am evil in your definition of evil. And that will mean that you feel like you are entitled to something as a result of your behavior, which would say that you're good. Although, like I've told you in the past, however much good you've done, I promise you I can empty your storehouse with all the bad you've done. If we want to read it that way, if you want to sit there and say, you know what? I'm a good person and I have proof because I have all of these things, or I'm a good person because I've done all these good things, I will get you your reciprocation. I will find you all of the bad things you've done that have outweighed that. Because I promise you, that's the concept, and that's the simplicity, because that's the threshold that you have to overcome in order to be a master. And until you do, you repeat the cycle. We know that from Yom Kippur. So now we have something interesting going on, because we have this concept that the title that you are supposed to have and the title that you're supposed to operate in is not the result of any information that you've been given from any human authority. Or maybe I should turn it a different way and say any human authority that was not emanating the intensification of all power in the universe. Because the intensification of all power in the universe is the one who has defined you. If you believe anybody other than him, then that is creating a false god. Why? Because you're still an Elohim. It doesn't change. Listen, an Elohim is an Elohim. It doesn't alter as a result of some merit. You've been created a certain way. You're a manifestation of the intensification of all power in the universe. You are an emanation. You are actually the creator. Dummy down, because there's no other way for creation to exist. I want you to understand that. He has to be involved. Okay? He has to be involved at the quantum level. Maybe we'll discover something more than the quantum level and say he has to be involved there too, holding stuff together, or maybe he is that stuff, right? Okay, so then the next element here would be, if for you, a necessity for you to what? Heal from your wounds? Sure. But better yet, understand that your wound is also a threshold. But better yet, we even say that healing from your wounds really doesn't exist, but what exists is rethinking your definition of who you are and standing upon that definition, because anything other than it is actually a problem, right? Anything other than the definition that was given by the meritless favor of Yeshua results in a problem. Now, does obedience to Torah grant you abundance and all of the other things? Yep, absolutely, it does. But you need to understand that that's not affecting your title as an Elohim. And specifically your title as the righteousness of God, which means basically you've been given the authority and the energy, the power to, and then when I say power, I mean the stuff that went out of Yeshua when the woman touched the hem of his garment. That stuff you've been given in order to accomplish your job as king, as authority. But the intrigue comes in the form of an understanding. And that understanding is that nothing else can define that. If it does, then you become a false Elohim. And if you're a false Elohim, you are contrary to not only the will of God, which is Torah, but to the merit of Yeshua, which is what? Doesn't have to do with doing something. You can't take away from it. You can't add to it. Now, there's one more element that I have to put into this when it comes to the light of Passover, because now we understand it can be wielded by a strong mind. What can be wielded? The abundance and deliverance of Passover? Yes, amen. But also the authority of Passover, right? And in that sense, what you need to understand is that as it trickled out over the world, there's a point where it got pulled back in. We can accept that. We understand that a season is a season. A Moedim is a Moedim, and it has a cycle. And when that cycle is complete, then the next Moedim or season comes along, and that has its own light. There's a light of Pentecost. There's a light of Tabernacles. Okay? There's a light of Yom Kippur. It's a difficult one, but there is a light of Yom Kippur. Now, then we have the idea that if you are not worthy of the light of Passover, then you are not a strong mind. Your ability to wield the light of Passover was never about your worth. Okay? Now, it is very important you understand that the way that you wield the light of Passover is you walk up to your neighbor and ask them for gold. Well, not quite like that, but you need to understand that you need to be expectant and you need to step into requesting that from the universe, right? Because that's just one of the gifts of He made him who knew no sin. Where in the world did you think that you could actually do something good enough to merit you to have a pile of gold, when all you do is injure others with your behavior? You need to understand it is the process of you injuring others that damages the merit that required the Yeshua principle in the first place. And you need to understand that that injury of others is just you redefining them. Which brings us to a very important point. Point number one, if you choose to continue to operate in your identity, you will not wield Passover. You will not wield the light of Passover. You are not a master. Don't think you are, because you're not. Your definition has been defined by some other thing. So what that means is the light of Passover cannot help you heal from your wound. If healing is coming, then that means that the natural state of the human mind is healthy. Now you say, well, wait a minute, let's talk about like Jeffrey Dahmer or somebody. Okay, fine, let's do that. Because I can almost guarantee you that we can trace a wound, but we can also trace entitlements, we can trace limiting beliefs, and somewhere along the lines we can identify that none of those things were reintroduced as truth the way that they're supposed to be. In other words, that he is actually what? The righteousness of God. That's right. Jeffrey Dahmer was the righteousness of God. Did he believe it? Nope. And he hurt a bunch of people. Welcome to reality. Because that's what you do too. You don't believe you're the righteousness of God, so you hurt people. You say, oh, I don't do that. Oh, yeah, you know what? I tell you what, I'm gonna tell you a secret. Let's say you're a husband, and you think that you're a good husband, and you think that you're a good father. I will bet you that if I went and had a one-on-one private with your wife or a one-on-one private with your children, they would tell me all the things where you are not one. Do you understand that? It is only by He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, and we might become the righteousness of God, that you are ever going to not hurt people. Do you understand that? And don't think for a second that you don't do it, because you do. You do. Now, let me tell you to what extent you do. You operate within your wounds. Yes. Okay, we've established that. We've established that is this right here. That's this mess. A persuasion, a manipulation of your identity that tells you you're something that you're not, and you believe it, and therefore you become it. You live in it. You manifest it. Okay? But then, this is the part that's crazy. You don't only do it to yourself. You actually look at other people as being those same similar kinds of identities. I will tell you right now, if you operate in a mode of distrust, say in business, or a mode of distrust, say in relationships, the reason you do is because you don't trust yourself. The reason you do is because you do not believe that you are actually trustworthy, because you are afraid that you might betray somebody because of some sort of information that is not true. Oh, but it gets worse. If someone who has stepped into this identity comes into your presence and you decide in your wounds that they are not the righteousness of God. Remember what I said, Jeffrey Dahmer was the righteousness of God. He just didn't believe it. And you try to convince them that they're not the righteousness of God. I want you to think about what it says about what happens if you teach one of the least of these innocent ones to break Torah. It will be better for a millstone to be put around your neck and cast into the sea. Right? Davy Jones Locker. All right. So now what we need to do is realize that there are two things that are very important. Denial of light is a result of persuasion. Denial of the light of Passover is the result of a false belief, and therefore you are a false Elohim, and therefore you are an enemy of God. Okay? And it says, while we were yet in sin, Christ died for us, and that we were enemies of God. Romans chapter 5, verse 8, I believe. Right? Oh, but it gets better, doesn't it? Because while you're yet in sin and enemies of God, what do you do to the people of God? What do you do to the ones who have accepted their identity as righteous and are trying to be the light? What do you do to them? You try to define them, right? And here's the part that's powerful about this. And the part that's dangerous about this. You view them either as a threat or a resource. Yeah, that's the sickness of the false Elohim. Why? Because you're not getting the light of Passover. Let me put that back up there so I can point at it. You're not getting the light of Passover. You are not experiencing the retroactive pouring out of the resurrection power. It says, if the spirit of him who resurrected Christ from the dead dwells within you, he will give life to your mortal bodies. He will give you the resurrection power. Resurrecting what? That dead corpse that's wounded. But now here's the part that's powerful. If they're a threat, how are you going to treat them? Are you going to treat them like the righteousness of God? Are you going to treat them like the light? Even if they've shown you to be the light? And how are you going to treat this? Because I can tell you, a heart cannot be split in two ways. It can't serve two masters. So once your heart leans in the form of hardness towards, say, a light worker, a person who's trying to give you the light, a person who's trying to offer to you something that would heal you or that would give you a leg up in your abundance or whatever, you are also going to deny the light of Passover. Because that's what a heart does, which means you'll view the light of Passover as a threat. Oh, no wonder they had to put blood on the doorposts. Because they would never have comprehended the light of Passover, would they? No, because they had a twisted mind. No wonder Yahweh had to make that condition. And no wonder he offered it to the Egyptians and to the Israelites. He offered it to the uncircumcised Philistine, as it were. He offered it to the Egyptians who practiced child sacrifice, exploitation of human beings, and the exploitation of women. And then in addition to that, also went and operated as false Elohim, admittedly believing that they were gods, but then really screwing up. And then we had the Israelites who were under covenant who did not believe their identity and were no better. What a mess. No wonder we had to put blood in the doorposts. You deny the light of Passover, you will not walk in abundance. And you will not walk in deliverance. And what do you need to be delivered from? All the oppression of the false identities. I swear this probably belongs in the renewing your mind series. But what you need to understand is that at the core of this thing is how the tabernacle was set up with the Holy of Holies, the holy place, the outer court, the Levites and the priests, the Israelites, and the unclean, and the uncircumcised Philistine, the nations. Not in covenant. In covenant, but unclean. In covenant, but not a Levite who can approach the tabernacle. A Levite, but not a priest who can approach the holy place. A priest, but not the high priest who can approach the Holy of Holies. It is sacred. Your mind is sacred, but it just needs a simple adjustment. It was never about what you could do or couldn't do. And your purpose or your failure or success of that purpose does not pull Yeshua off. It doesn't pull the nails out of his hands. You need to understand the worst of the worst. You go all the way back to the most darkest people of history. And Yeshua did not get off that place where he was dying. And you need to understand that to be true in such a way that it causes you to be able to step into something that I'm telling you right now, not only do you not deserve, and I'm going to tell you, the short version of this is if you define yourself as good, then you were operating in the knowledge of good and evil, and therefore your eyes are opened, and therefore you will not be allowed in the garden, which equates to the promised land, which equates to what? The extreme of the three things that are in the tent: provision, protection, and destruction. What's extreme protection? An enemy attacking you one way and fleeing 5 ways. They come at you and they're like, oh, my bad, and scatter, right? What's the extreme of provision? Abundance. What's the extreme of instruction? Esoteric revelation. Right? In which we are masters of the universe. When we step into the knowledge of things like falling into synchronization with the Fibonacci sequence, or falling into synchronization with the trees who are more obedient than we are to the instruction that's right in front of us, that Paul said it's what has been made that makes you without excuse, not what's written down. I promise you, you are destroying people's identities with your wounds, your limiting beliefs, and your entitlements. And you are hurting people with those. And if you think for a second that you can operate in your wound and operate in the light, you got another thing coming. You can't do both. And I promise you, if you're operating within your wound, you're operating in darkness, and that's malevolence, which means it's what? Sucking the light out of others. So are you worthy of the light of Passover? You better believe it. Do you believe it? I don't know. But if you don't, you're going to hurt people. And if you don't, you are definitely going to make a mess of your life. But if you accept that this was a free gift, and you accept that there was a way to activate it, a way to wield it, then you will understand. You'll understand why you look at someone else in their prosperity and feel jealousy. Do you know what jealousy is? Jealousy is proof you're not walking in your purpose. That's all it is. I used to get so jealous of people all the time. People who were more free than me, people who were more in love than me, people who were more wealthy than me, people who were more happy than me, people who were cooler than me because they actually had air conditioning, people who were hotter than me because they actually had heat. Whatever it was, I was jealous of. They just got a new Suburban. They just had a new baby. Whatever I was jealous of. And my mentor finally one day said, I will not tolerate it anymore. Your jealousy is darkness. and I'm tired of it. And I had my tail between the legs and my ears down and my head tucked. And he said, Kinitavnu, you are not walking in your purpose. If you did, you would not feel a jealousy. You would feel an abundance that you don't understand. And back then, I didn't know anything about wielding it. All I knew is that I wasn't allowed to be jealous anymore, and I had made my mentor mad. But now I know, if I ever think, man, it's not fair that that person has that. It's because I'm not walking in my purpose. And why am I not walking in my purpose? If it is meritless and I'm enabled, and all I got to do is walk. Look, all they had to do was leave Egypt. That's all they had to do. And they continued to walk. They walked and 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 walked into the promised land. But all they had to do was walk. All they had to do was walk away. That's all you need to do with your brain and your mind, is dismiss the false identity that you are anything other than what the intensification of all power in the universe says you are. Remember the cycle's teaching that if you exist, it's proof that you're valuable. That definition in and of itself stops everything else, stops all the voices. As my dad calls it, the committee. The committee of people that says, oh, you're not worthy. Oh, you're not allowed to do this. Oh, you know what? You shouldn't do this because you're going to hurt this person over here. Oh, you shouldn't start this because you'll never be successful. It's all garbage. And even the most adverse and difficult circumstance still does not define you. And it doesn't change provision, protection, and instruction unless you step outside the tent. And once you step outside the tent, you don't have any power. You don't have a strong mind, which means what? You're going to be the damage that this world does not need. But if you stay in the tent, you stay in the instruction, you operate within the confines of the truth of who you are, you will go out and tame, and you will become the change that this world needs. You will go out and cultivate and tame, instead of going out and being a ferocious beast or being a terror. It's as simple as that. And in the end, the simplicity of this practice is probably the most difficult thing that I have ever had to do. Oh, it's so hard. And I can tell you it's even harder because of my failures and because of the people who I've already hurt in my life and came to that realization and empathy and pain of. When I finally said, oh my God, look at this swath of destruction I left. Now my heart says, yeah, and that means you don't deserve anything. And people are, let me tell you something. If you believe that, people are ready to accommodate you in that real easy. But if I am the righteousness of God, then you got nothing coming if you think you're going to bring any false information saying I'm anything else. And believe you me, I will have the abundance and you will not. Or you can join me in the light of Passover and walk in that abundance. And you can walk in that deliverance. You can be free from these things that just plague you, cause you to have vice, cause you to have addictions, cause you to destroy relationships, cause you to exploit human beings. You could be free of it. But you have to accept that the only reason why this happened is because you were never going to be able to merit it. You screw it up too much because you believe that persuasion. Did the serpent lie? Nope, I just proved it to you today. The serpent never lied. He never lied. But unfortunately, what he did is try to convince Adam and Eve that they could do something good, or that they could define something as good, or that they could define something as evil. Let me tell you, it is not for you to decide whether a person is good or evil. Don't get me wrong. There is definitely proof of malevolence in fruit. And there's definitely proof of benevolence in fruit. And I could tell you that those definitions don't mesh. So now, what does this mean for you right now? Well, there's a number of things. The first one is that obviously you're going to have to accept that whether you like it or not, you have done damage. Okay, that's number one. Number two, you need to accept that your wound is your making. It's of your making. I don't care what happened to you. You constructed the definition of who you are. Okay? And all of the universe declares something different than what you believe. Okay? Number three, you need to accept that what is available to you, you've already been instructed to walk in, and you've already been instructed to wield. You need to understand, we're not waiting for a time when all of a sudden God will say, okay, start using your powers. Yeshua said, you always have the poor among you. So don't think that an instruction of tithe will change that. If you always have the poor among you and you choose not to take care of them, then the reciprocation is you become poor. There's nothing written that says that, per se. So in that sense, then it is very important for you to realize if shalom or joy or contentment or excitement or arousal or any other positive energy mechanism tries to come into your life and you reject it, you will hurt others. If something like that tries to come into your life and you reject it, you are a slave, not a master. And you're a slave of something that is destroying humanity. If those things try to come into your life and you reject them, the universe is going to obey you. Oh, you don't want this one. Got it. Pull out. Right? Yeshua said that if these don't cry out, the very rocks would cry out. And furthermore, Mordecai said to Hadassah, he says, listen, salvation will come to the Jews by some manner, if not by you. But how do you know that you were not raised up for such a time as this? Isn't that amazing? Mordecai knew that Israel was going to be delivered because of his faith. But he wanted Esther to walk in her purpose. She didn't have to. She could have chose not to walk in her purpose, and the Jews would still have been delivered. Whoa. So that means that you actually could walk in your purpose, deliver a nation, and become something amazing. Or not. But I promise you, if you're not the change that this world needs, you're the problem in this world, and I promise you that means that you're going to hurt people. There's no other way to put it. So practical application, believe the righteousness of God. Believe you're the righteousness of God. There couldn't be a simpler process that could be so difficult to accomplish. You have to stop believing all the voices. You have to stop believing all the information that's coming at you, telling you you're something that you're not. Oh, it is so difficult. I hate it. But it's true. You want to be the change that this world needs, you need to believe you are something more than just what you can do or can't do. And you need to believe that if you're going to affect, one way or another, you're going to affect this earth. One way or another, you're going to affect this world. You're either going to make it worse or you're going to make it better. If you want to make it better, then you need to stop thinking the way that you've been thinking about things. Humans are not threats, okay? You're the threat to the human who's actually the righteousness of God. But if you tell them that they're a threat, then there'll be a threat, because it's really, really hard for them to know that they're valuable because they were created. It's hard to believe, especially with all the adversity that happens in our lives. It's hard to believe that there is something that cares about us. Okay, so the light of Passover is a season. It's going to come, it's going to go, and that's that. What you do with the light of Passover is actually about if you are a master or not. Who defines that? Not you. Who gives you the power of that? Not you. But once you wield that, it is according to your will how it is wielded, and it is according to your sovereignty as a master. That's the amazing thing about this. Here, Adam, I'm gonna make this huge, humongous globe of mess that you get to play with, and whatever you say goes, and whatever your children say goes, whether they believe it or not, whether they believe in me or not, whatever they say goes. All of this whole entire globe of mess is going to obey you no matter what. Going to obey you no matter what. Whether you choose to believe that it obeys you or not, that just doesn't matter. It's going to do it. And then all of a sudden we come around to the 20th and 21st century, and all of a sudden scientists are going, hey, look, this is obeying us. Anyways, so now I'm going to give all this to you, Adam, and you can do all this stuff with it. Oh, by the way, here's some power too, zing. And what does he do? I don't even want to think about it. But the point being is that there is a solution to it. And that solution has to do with your identity. Now, we could get in all kinds of things with the imagination series. We can get into all kinds of things about manifestation and abundance and the law of attraction and all this other stuff, or you can just accept that you are at the focal point of all of creation. You are concentric to everything. We may be heliocentric in this universe, but I can tell you right now, everything is orbiting around you. Okay? All right.